Temperatures plummeted to 30 below zero. Winds sheared the tops off pine trees like matchsticks. One woman stranded in the unforgiving Rockies with a shattered axle, and a fading child made a desperate choice. She buried them alive. And it was the only reason they survived the deadliest winter of 1878. Snowflakes the size of silver dollars began to fall, spiraling down from a sky that had turned the color of a bruised plum. Josephine Miller stood in the freezing mud of the Coshatopa Pass, her breath pluming in violent, jagged gasps. At her feet lay the ruin of her entire life, a Murphy-covered wagon pitched violently to the right, its heavy oak rear axle snapped cleanly in two like a dry wishbone. Inside the tilted wagon bed, huddled beneath a mountain of thin wool blankets, was her 8-year-old son, Leo. His coughing fits rattled through the canvas, a wet, heavy sound that made Josephine's chest tighten with an unbearable panic. They were completely alone. Just 2 hours earlier they had a guide. Elias Harding was a grizzled, hard-eyed frontiersman who had taken $50, every cent Josephine had to her name, to lead them safely from Denver to a mining claim in Gunnison, Colorado. Elias had sworn they could beat the winter storms. He had sworn the pass was clear. But when the wagon wheel slipped into a hidden ravine, violently snapping the axle and bringing their journey to a devastating halt, Elias's demeanor had shifted instantly. Josephine remembered the exact look in his eyes. It was the terrifying, hollow stare of a man who had suddenly realized he was looking at dead weight. Without a word of apology, Elias had cut the lead draft horse from its traces. "Elias, what are you doing?" Josephine had screamed over the rising wind. "Going for help, Mrs. Miller." He had lied, refusing to meet her gaze. He swung himself onto the bare back of the horse, his knuckles white as he gripped the mane. "I'll bring a rescue party from the settlement. You stay put." He didn't even leave them his spare rifle. As the horse's hoofbeats faded into the gathering whiteout, Josephine knew, with cold, absolute certainty, that Elias Harding was never coming back. He had abandoned a widow and a sick child to die in the Rocky Mountains so he could save his own skin. Now the silence of the pass was deafening, broken only by the sinister low whistle of the approaching front. The locals in Denver had warned her about this specific type of storm. They called it the White Death, a fast-moving blizzard that could drop 5 feet of snow in a single night and bring winds capable of freezing a man's blood in his veins in under an hour. Josephine looked at the shattered wagon. It offered no real shelter. The canvas was already whipping wildly, the wind slicing straight through the thin fabric. In a few hours the temperature would drop to a lethal negative 30 degrees. Sitting in the wagon meant freezing to death before midnight. Leaving the wagon meant wandering blindly into a white abyss and dying in minutes. Desperation is a powerful catalyst for human ingenuity. Josephine tied a thick wool scarf over her nose and mouth and began to scour the immediate perimeter. The terrain was brutal, jagged granite outcroppings, steep drop-offs, and dense thickets of black pine. But about 60 yards from the broken wagon, she spotted something that made her heart skip a beat. It was a geological anomaly. A massive, towering slab of limestone jutted out from the mountainside, and carved into its base was a natural rock hollow. It wasn't quite a cave. It was more of a deep, crescent-shaped indentation eroded by thousands of years of wind and water. It was roughly 10 feet wide, 8 feet deep, and arched like the roof of a cathedral. It was shielded from the direct onslaught of the northern wind by a thick barricade of ancient boulders. Josephine ran to the hollow and stepped inside. The difference was immediate. The howling wind was instantly muffled, and the air was still. It was dry. A wild, impossible idea began to form in her mind. If she could somehow move their supplies into this hollow, they might survive the night. But Leo was too weak to walk, and she couldn't carry enough firewood, food, and blankets by hand before the storm hit full force. Furthermore, an open cave would still become a freezing tomb once the blizzard wrapped around the mountain. She needed a door. She needed a barrier. She looked back at the crippled Murphy wagon. Then she looked at the dimensions of the rock hollow. I don't need to move the supplies, she realized, her heart hammering against her ribs. I need to move the wagon. The physics of moving a 2-ton wagon with a broken axle by hand should have been impossible for a single woman standing 5'5". But Josephine Miller was operating on a potent cocktail of maternal terror and raw adrenaline. She had less than 90 minutes before the blizzard would blind her completely. The snow was already accumulating, biting at her exposed wrists and stinging her eyes. First, she had to lighten the load. She climbed into the tilted wagon bed, kissed Leo's feverish forehead, and told him to hold on tight. She began throwing heavy, non-essential items out into the snow: an iron cast stove, heavy trunks of clothes, books, and mining tools she had hoped to sell. She kept only the food, the blankets, a small kerosene lantern, and the remaining water. Next, she grabbed a heavy pickaxe from the discarded pile. The broken right rear axle was digging deep into the frozen earth, acting as an anchor. Josephine fell to her knees in the snow and used the pickaxe to fiercely chop away the frozen mud beneath the broken stump. Once it was slightly free, she sprinted to their food stores, grabbed a tin of rendered bacon fat, and slathered the thick grease all over the splintered wood and the rocks directly in its path. She was turning the broken axle into a makeshift ski, but grease alone wouldn't pull a wagon. Josephine dug through the mining equipment Elias had left behind and found a heavy-duty block and tackle a system of pulleys designed for hauling massive boulders out of mine shafts. Her fingers were already going numb, turning a terrifying shade of blue. She wrapped them in strips of cloth torn from her own petticoat and got to work. She dragged the heavy iron hook to the rock hollow and jammed it securely into a deep fissure in the limestone wall. She ran the thick hemp rope through the pulley, dragged it back to the wagon, and tied it in a massive knot around the sturdy front axle. Then she stood between the wagon and the cave, gripped the rope, wrapped it around her waist for leverage, and leaned forward with every ounce of strength she possessed. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. The rope pulled taut, snapping like a violin string, but the wagon didn't budge. Josephine screamed a primal sound that was swallowed entirely by the wind and drove her leather boots into the mud, pulling until she felt a muscle tear agonizingly in her left shoulder. Crack! The greased axle stump slid forward over a rock. The wagon lurched. Josephine gasped for air and pulled again. Inch by agonizing inch, the heavy wooden wagon scraped across the rocky terrain. Her hands bled through the cloth wrappings, leaving bright red smears on the rough hemp rope. Her lungs burned as if she were inhaling shattered glass. But she didn't stop. Every time she wanted to quit, she heard Leo's weak cough from inside the canvas, and she pulled harder. 40 yards, 20 yards, 10 yards. The blizzard was fully upon them now. Visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. The wind was shrieking a deafening roar that sounded like a locomotive rushing off its tracks. With one final monumental heave, Josephine dragged the wagon backward into the rock hollow. It scraped against the limestone ceiling and jammed tight. The fit was miraculously close. The back half of the wagon was entirely swallowed by the rock overhang, perfectly shielded from the elements. But the front half of the wagon, the open archway where the driver sat, was still exposed to the roaring storm. Furthermore, there was a jagged gap of about 6 to 8 inches all around the perimeter, where the curved canvas roof met the uneven rock walls. If she left those gaps open, the wind would funnel through the hollow like a wind tunnel, ripping the canvas to shreds and freezing them in minutes. She had to seal it. She had to seal every single gap. Josephine rushed to the front of the wagon. The wind was so strong now she could barely stand. She grabbed the massive 50-pound sack of flour they had bought in St. Louis. She hauled it to the edge of the cave, grabbed a metal bucket, and began furiously packing it with snow. She poured the flour into the snow, mixing it with her bare, bleeding hands. In the freezing temperatures, the wet flour paste didn't just turn to dough, it turned to a fast-setting cement. She grabbed handfuls of the freezing sludge and began violently cramming it into the gaps between the wagon canvas and the rock wall. She packed it with pine needles, dead branches, and frozen mud, sealing the edges airtight. The cold was agonizing. She couldn't feel her fingers anymore. They were stiff, useless blocks of ice. She used her forearms and elbows to pack the thick paste into the cracks. As she worked her way up to the roof of the wagon, she had to stand on the driver's bench, balancing precariously, as the wind tried to tear her off. She stuffed the last of the gaps with the heavy woolen coats Elias had left behind, plastering them over with the freezing flour paste. The final gap was the front opening of the wagon itself. Josephine scrambled inside, pulling the heavy canvas flaps shut behind her. She tied them tightly with leather straps, then dragged a heavy wooden crate against the flaps, blocking it completely. She collapsed onto the floorboards of the wagon, gasping for breath in absolute pitch-black darkness. Outside, the storm hit its terrifying apex. The mountain outside screamed. The wind slammed against the sealed wagon with the force of a physical blow. The wood groaned, and the canvas snapped tightly, but it held. The hollow had effectively turned the wagon into a cork shoved tightly into a bottle. The blizzard simply skipped right over the curved rock above them, sending the deadly winds sweeping past their makeshift bunker rather than into it. Josephine struck a match with trembling hands and lit the small kerosene lantern. The dim, warm glow illuminated the interior of the wagon. It was small, cramped, and smelled of wet wool and blood, but it was safe. She crawled over to Leo. He was pale, shivering violently, but he opened his eyes. "Mama," he whispered. "I'm here, Leo." She sobbed, wrapping her arms around him, burying him beneath the remaining blankets. "We're safe. The storm can't get us in here." But as the first hour passed, Josephine's relief was suddenly shattered by a new, horrifying realization. The air inside the wagon was growing stale, incredibly fast. She had done her job too well. In her desperation to keep the freezing wind out, she had sealed every single gap perfectly tight. The flour and ice mixture had hardened into an impenetrable shell. The rock walls behind them were solid. As the kerosene lantern began to flicker and dim, starved of oxygen, Josephine realized the horrifying twist of her brilliant survival tactic. She hadn't just built a shelter. She had built a completely airtight coffin, and with 2 people breathing, plus a kerosene lantern, burning up the precious remaining air. They were going to suffocate long before they ever froze. Panic took root within the cramped confines of the sealed wagon as the golden flame of the kerosene lantern began to dance erratically. Josephine watched in mounting horror as the bright, cheerful yellow light shifted into a sickly, ghostly blue. It sputtered violently, casting long, frantic shadows against the canvas walls before dying out completely with a pathetic hiss. Plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness, the terrifying reality of her brilliant survival strategy became undeniable. The thick flour and ice paste she had furiously packed into every crevice had dried into an impenetrable concrete barrier. She had successfully barricaded the deadly -30-degree blizzard outside, but she had also barricaded all the oxygen outside with it. Carbon dioxide is a silent, insidious assassin. It does not announce its presence with a harsh odor or a painful sting. It simply lulls the body into a heavy, intoxicating lethargy. Josephine could already feel the initial symptoms creeping into her bloodstream. A dull, throbbing ache blossomed behind her eyes, and her thoughts began to turn sluggish and thick like molasses poured over cold iron. Her own breathing sounded disproportionately loud in the silent wagon, each inhalation coming faster and shallower than the last. Beside her on the wooden floorboards, little Leo was completely unresponsive. When she reached out blindly in the dark, her trembling fingers brushed against his chest. It was barely moving. Desperation, raw and metallic, flooded her veins, momentarily overriding the toxic lethargy. She had to puncture the seal. But a terrifying paradox paralyzed her. If she tore open the canvas flap or broke a large hole in the ice mortar, the wind tunnel effect would instantly resume. The roaring blizzard outside would blast freezing air into the wagon, dropping the internal temperature to a fatal level in mere minutes. They would survive asphyxiation, only to die of hypothermia before dawn. She needed a way to introduce oxygen slowly, a controlled vent that would allow them to breathe without turning their shelter into a meat freezer. Crawling on her hands and knees in the total darkness, Josephine blindly felt her way toward the discarded wooden crates near the front of the wagon. Her frost-bitten fingers, clumsy and numb, knocked over empty tin cups and scattered dry beans across the floor. She needed something hollow, something sturdy enough to pierce the frozen concrete shell without shattering. Her hand brushed against a heavy rectangular velvet box, her late husband's navigational equipment. With a frantic sob of hope, she flipped the brass latches and pulled out a heavy maritime spyglass. Using the heavy iron handle of a frying pan, Josephine ruthlessly smashed the glass lenses at both ends of the telescope, shaking out the fractured shards until she was left with a hollow, tapered brass tube. It was approximately 14 inches long and 2 inches in diameter. It was the perfect makeshift pipe. Now came the agonizing task of breaching the wall. She dragged herself toward the front corner of the canvas, where she knew the ice mortar was thickest. She pressed the narrow end of the brass tube against the frozen flour paste and pushed with all her remaining weight. It felt like pushing against solid granite. The freezing temperatures had cured the mixture into a literal rock. She needed heat. Searching her pockets frantically, she found her last 3 matches. She grabbed a thin iron fire poker from her supplies. Striking the first match, she held the tiny flickering flame directly beneath the iron tip of the poker until the flame licked her fingers, forcing her to drop it. She repeated this with the second, and then the third match, heating the iron just enough to make it marginally warm. With absolutely no time to spare, she jammed the slightly warmed iron poker into the frozen mortar. It hissed, melting a microscopic indentation into the ice. Before the indentation could freeze over again, Josephine grabbed the brass telescope, positioned it over the tiny divot, and brought the heavy iron frying pan down onto the flat end of the brass tube like a blacksmith's hammer. Clang! The brass bit slightly into the ice. Clang! Clang! Her shoulder muscles screamed in agony, tearing further with every violent strike, but she refused to stop. The heavy metallic strikes echoed loudly within the hollowed limestone, a desperate rhythm of survival against the roaring wind outside. With one final brutal swing, the brass tube punched through the remaining layer of the frozen barrier. Instantly, a concentrated jet of -30-degree air shot through the brass cylinder and blasted into the wagon like a physical spear of solid ice. The sheer kinetic force of the wind entering the small space knocked Josephine backward. The influx of oxygen was immediate and intoxicating, but the drop in temperature was equally swift and completely terrifying. Within 30 seconds, the relatively warm air inside the wagon was sucked out, replaced by an agonizing, biting cold that made Josephine's lungs burn with every panicked inhalation. She lunged forward and slammed her heavily gloved palm flat against the open end of the brass tube. The violent hissing stopped immediately. The icy wind was blocked. She had inadvertently created a manual valve. In order to keep them both alive, she would have to act as the wagon's mechanical lung. She removed her hand for 10 seconds, allowing the freezing, oxygen-rich air to spray into the cabin, filling the space with breathable air. Then she slammed her hand back over the hole, sealing it tightly for 2 minutes, to allow the trapped air to warm slightly from the latent body heat radiating beneath their thick wool blankets. Josephine crawled back to her son, dragging the heavy blankets with her. She positioned herself right next to the brass tube. For the next 48 hours she did not sleep a single wink. If she fell asleep and let her hand slip from the tube, the freezing air would pump into the cabin continuously, and they would freeze to death. If she fell asleep with her hand permanently blocking the tube, the carbon dioxide would build up again, and they would suffocate. She sat there in the blinding darkness, a human metronome of survival. Open the valve. Count to 10. Close the valve. Count to 120. Hallucinations began to plague her sleep-deprived mind. She heard her late husband whispering from the dark corners of the wagon. She saw phantom lights dancing on the canvas. Her arm went entirely numb, her muscles locking into a painful, rigid cramp, but her palm never faltered from its rhythm. She was a mother, keeping her child breathing one agonizing pulse of air at a time. Dawn broke on the 3rd day without fanfare. The deafening locomotive roar of the blizzard finally began to recede, replaced by a haunting, heavy silence that felt almost unnatural. Josephine's eyes were bloodshot, her face pale and drawn, her lips cracked and bleeding. The small beam of actual sunlight that suddenly pierced through the brass tube illuminated a grim scene. Frost coated every interior surface of the canvas. She had survived the night. The storm was over. But as she reached toward the heavy wooden crate blocking the front canvas flaps, preparing to finally break the seal and step out into the freezing light, a deep, terrifying vibration rattled through the limestone walls of the mountain hollow. It was a low, guttural hum that seemed to originate from the very core of the earth, vibrating upward through the wooden wheels of the wagon. High above their sheltered rock crescent, millions of tons of freshly deposited snow had accumulated on a steep, unstable slope. The sudden drop in wind, combined with the microscopic warming of the morning sun, had broken the fragile surface tension. The avalanche hit with the catastrophic force of an exploding bomb. The deafening roar swallowed the world. Josephine threw herself over Leo, covering his body with her own, as the wagon shook violently, the thick oak floorboards groaning under an immense unseen pressure. The towering limestone archway above them took the direct kinetic brunt of the disaster, acting as a massive stone shield that split the falling mountain of snow perfectly in half, diverting the deadly flow around their hidden pocket. However, while the rock hollow saved them from being instantly crushed into splinters, it could not save them from being buried. Thousands of pounds of dense, compacted avalanche debris packed tightly over the entrance of the cave, sealing the wagon under 12 feet of solid white ice. The small beam of sunlight shining through the brass tube was instantly extinguished. Total darkness violently reclaimed the cabin. The brass lung was choked with heavy snow. Oxygen was completely cut off once again. Josephine lay trembling in the dark, tears freezing instantly on her bruised cheeks. They had survived a shattered axle, a treacherous abandonment, a lethal blizzard, and a suffocating vacuum, only to be buried alive in a frozen tomb. She knew with a crushing certainty that no one was looking for them. Elias had undoubtedly spun a lie to save himself. To the rest of the world, Josephine and Leo Miller simply ceased to exist. 50 miles away, in the bustling, muddy mining settlement of Gunnison, Elias Harding sat in a warm saloon, nursing a glass of cheap whiskey. He had arrived alone the previous evening, spinning a tragic tale of a flash flood during a dangerous river crossing that had swept the poor widow and her child away before he could secure the ropes. The locals had bought the story. Death was a common currency in the untamed Rockies. But Elias had made one fatal greedy mistake. Sitting near the warm iron stove was a local territorial marshal named Harrison. Harrison was a quiet, observant man with eyes like chipped flint. He wasn't paying attention to Elias's dramatic story. He was paying attention to the horse Elias had ridden into town. It was a magnificent draft horse, but more importantly, it carried a custom-tooled leather saddle with the initials JM stamped deeply into the horn. Harrison knew Elias was a drifter who couldn't afford a saddle worth $50. He also noticed Elias kept nervously checking his pockets, his boots completely free of the deep reddish mud characteristic of the riverbanks he claimed to have crossed. Without drawing his weapon, Harrison calmly walked over, grabbed Elias by the collar of his woolen coat, and threw him violently against the wooden bar. A brief, brutal interrogation followed. Elias, fundamentally a coward, broke down crying within 3 minutes, confessing that he had left them stranded near the limestone caves at the Koshatopa Pass. Harrison locked Elias in the local holding cell and immediately deputized 6 miners. They rode out within the hour, bringing long steel probing poles and heavy iron shovels, though Harrison secretly told the men to expect a body recovery mission, not a rescue. No one survived 3 days in the pass, let alone through an avalanche. Deep beneath the snowpack, Josephine was completely out of options, but she refused to let her son die quietly in the dark. She grabbed the heavy iron fire poker and a cast-iron skillet. She unlaced the front flaps of the canvas, pushing through the frozen flour mortar, only to hit a solid wall of compacted avalanche snow. Working purely on adrenaline and maternal rage, she began to dig. She carved into the dense snowpack with the iron poker, using the skillet to pull the heavy chunks of ice backward into the wagon bed. The snow was packed so tightly it felt like mining solid coal. Hours bled into one another. Her frost-bitten hands tore open, leaving dark smears of crimson blood frozen in the white walls of her escape tunnel. She dug upward, carving a narrow claustrophobic shaft toward the surface. 6 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet. Her muscles began to fail, her vision blurred black spots, dancing in her peripheral vision, as the oxygen in the small tunnel rapidly depleted. She hit a dense layer of surface ice, a thick, frozen crust that refused to yield to the blunt iron poker. She struck it once, twice. The iron bounced off the ice. Josephine's arms dropped to her sides. She had nothing left. She collapsed backward into the dark tunnel, sliding down the icy chute back into the wagon. She crawled blindly to the mattress, pulled Leo tightly against her chest and closed her eyes, whispering a gentle final lullaby into his hair as the cold darkness finally began to pull her under. Suddenly, a strange sound echoed through the ceiling. Crunch, crunch, crunch. It was rhythmic. It was deliberate. Above the surface, Harrison's bloodhound, a massive rescue dog named Buster, had suddenly stopped pacing the avalanche field. The dog began digging furiously at a patch of snow, his keen nose picking up the faint, unmistakable scent of rendered bacon fat, the very grease Josephine had used to lubricate the broken axle days before. Harrison shoved his steel probe deep into the snow. It didn't hit rock. It hit the hollow canvas roof of a buried Murphy wagon. "Dig!" Harrison roared over the wind. "Dig now!" The 6 miners descended on the spot, with shovels clearing the 12 feet of snow in a matter of frantic minutes. When they finally broke through the surface ice and ripped away the frozen canvas flaps, sunlight flooded the interior of the wrecked wagon. Harrison crawled inside his lantern, illuminating the incredible scene. the perfect concrete seal of flour and ice, the hollowed brass telescope protruding from the wall, and huddled in the center, barely breathing but undeniably alive, were Josephine and Leo Miller. They were carefully wrapped in warm furs and rushed back to Gunnison. Miraculously, despite severe frostbite and exhaustion, both mother and son fully recovered. Elias Harding stood before the territorial judge, the custom leather saddle sitting on the evidence table, and was sentenced to 20 years in the federal penitentiary. Josephine never returned to the treacherous mountain passes. She settled in the valley, her story echoing through the saloons and mining camps, cementing her legacy as the woman who fought the deadliest blizzard in history, buried herself alive, and won. This incredible survival story proves that a mother's love is the ultimate force of nature. Josephine's ingenuity against the brutal winter is a testament to the resilient human spirit. If this harrowing journey kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories of survival against all odds. Leave a comment below on what you would do in her icy shoes.